Alright guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be answering one very simple question: should you play a Warlock in TBC Classic? As always guys, if you want to support the channel and see more videos like this, please subscribe to the channel, like the video and tell me what you think about the Warlock in the comment section down below. For this video we will cover three main topics: new key spells and talents, playstyle overview, PvE and PvP performance. Let's take a look at all the brand spanking new spells. First of all, we have Seed of Corruption. Embeds a demon seed in the enemy target, causing 1044 shadow damage over 18 seconds. When the target takes 1044 total damage or dies, the seed will inflict 1010 to 1290 shadow damage to all other enemies within 15 yards of the target. Only one corruption spell per target, per Warlock can be active on any one target. This means you can't use this on multiple enemies, and you also can't use corruption on the target too at the same time. So Seed of Corruption is probably the most lethal AoE ability in the game. When there's enough single target damage flying on the Seed of Corruption target, this will just continue to erupt and erupt over and over again and do insane AoE damage for as long as you have mana available to you. Next we have Fell Armor. So Blizzard decided to give the Warlock a spell power buff rather than a tanking buff, which was obviously quite needed. So surrounds a caster with Fell energy, increase the amount of health generated through spells and effects by 26%, and increasing spell damage up to 130%. Only one type of armor can be active on the Warlock at any time, lasts 30 minutes, and by the way, those increased effects of 26% and 130 extra spell damage, they are talented. We'll talk more about that later, but obviously very simple buff that increases your spell power and also the health you generate back with Drain Life. Next we have the Ritual of Souls. Don't think I really need to read the tooltip with this one. Basically it summons a soul well, which would be a visual well that you can see on the ground, and what people can do is that they can just click it and it gives them a health stone, so you don't have to manually trade everyone. A health stone is an absolute godsend ability for TBC raiding. Next we have Soul Shatter. Reduces threat by 50% for all enemies within 50 yards. It has a 5-minute cooldown and will consume a soul shard, so this is another godsend ability because it basically halves your threat in half. Absolutely guaranteed to take your threat off the boss, and it has an extremely high radius, so it will take your AoE off, any target that you've done AoE damage to. Next we have Incinerate. So deals fire damage to your target and an additional little bit of damage if you have Immolate on the target. So this becomes the Fire Warlock's main filler ability. Well, it is a filler ability, but honestly it is the main damaging ability for a Fire Warlock. I'll talk more about the Fire Warlock a little bit later on, but this is essentially a fiery version of the Shadowbolt spell. It's also important to mention that the Curse of Element spell has been changed because Curse of Shadow has been removed and just merged into Curse of Elements. Next we have the talented spells. So first of all we have Unstable Affliction at the end of the Affliction tree. Shadowy energy slowly destroys the target, causing 660 damage over 18 seconds. In addition, if this is dispelled, it would cause 990 damage to the dispeller and silence them for 5 seconds. You will mainly see Unstable Affliction in a PvP environment because what it does is just totally protects your DPS target from being dispelled, because people don't want to dispel a target with Unstable Affliction because they don't want to get silenced for 5 seconds. And also we have the new pet, the Felguard, which has a number of new abilities. First of all, Anguish, which is essentially a 5-second cooldown taunt ability. Then we have Cleave, which is basically very similar to a Warrior's Cleave. We have a passive called Demonic Frenzy. The Felguard's damaging melee attacks cause a Demonic Frenzy, increasing attack power by 5% for 10 seconds, and this will stack 10 times. And then we have a Intercept ability, which is again like the Warrior's Intercept. And the last new ability is Shadow Fury. Shadow Fury is unleashed, causing a certain amount of damage and stunning all targets within 8 yards for 2 seconds. So it's essentially a AoE stun that actually does a decent amount of damage. So let's cover some of the main changes to the talent and also those new cool additions. First of all we have Soul Siphon, which has been changed from a flat increase of Drain Life to being increased by an additional 5% for each affliction effect on the target to a maximum of 6%. It also does stack with Fell Armor. So these effects can be anything. They can be, you know, Corruption, Curse of Agony, all those effects, but it also includes, you know, the debuff Shadow Embrace, and also things like Fear. So sometimes, you know, fully dotting a target and then putting them in a fear and then using Drain Life will provide loads and loads of health back to the Warlock. Improved Drain Soul has been totally changed to be way better and way easier to use. It will just give you 15% of your maximum mana back whenever you're using it on a target that dies. And it also reduces the Affliction spell threat generation by 10%. Next we have a new talent called Shadow Embrace. Your Corruption, Curse of Agony, basically all your dot spells, cause the Shadow Embrace effect, which reduces the physical damage caused by that target by a total of 5% when fully talented, which is great at smoothing out damage on the tank. Next we have Contagion. Basically it's a flat damage increase to your Affliction spells and also reduce the chance that they can be dispelled. Improved Howl of Terror will make your Howl of Terror spell an instant cast, which is really useful. Then we have Malediction, just a slight damage boost to your Curse of Elements. And then that is it for the Affliction tree. Let's move on to Demonology. The first great change for the Demonology tree is that the Fell Intellect and Fell Stamina talents will not just increase the stamina and intellect of your demon, but also you as the Warlock. Then we have the Demonic Aegis talent, which increases the effectiveness of both Demon Armor and Fell Armor by 30%, so it will increase, like I mentioned before, the health, regeneration of Drain Life, and also the spell power. And then obviously the resistances and the armor that Demon Armor provides, which is really useful for when you have to do some Warlock tanking. We have a new talent here called Mana Feed. Whenever you use Drain Mana or Life Tap to gain your mana back, your pet actually gains 100% of the mana you gain, so it basically gives your pet infinite mana. This is a really strong talent. Here we have Master Demonologist, which is largely unchanged, apart from a few tweaks here and there, but obviously we have to account for the fact that you get the Felguard in TBC. And when you have the Felguard summon, it increases all your damage caused by 5%, and your resistances by 0.5 per level, which is a total of 35 increased resistances at level 70. We also have Demonic Resilience, which reduces the chance you'll be critically hit by melee and spells by 3%, but also reduces the damage your Summon Demon takes by 15%. Then obviously you have Demonic Tactics and then Summon Felguard. But the main key talent in the Demonology tree is Demonic Knowledge, which increases the spell damage of you and equal to 12% of your total demon's stamina plus intellect. So what you will find is that Demonology spec Warlocks will always actually have more spell damage than any other of these specs. Now let's move on to the Destruction tree, which is honestly the least change out of all the three. First of all, we have a new talent called Never Protection, which is useful for both PvE and PvP, but mainly for PvP. So whenever you're hit by a shadow or fire spell, you have a 30% chance to become immune to shadow and fire spells for 4 seconds. We also have Ember Storm, which is massively the same, but it reduces the cast time of Incinerate by eventually a total of 10%, so just a few milliseconds. Then we have Backlash. Whenever you're hit by a melee attack, you have a 25% chance to actually make your next Shadow Ball or Incinerate a totally instant cast, which is really useful, and also increases your crit chance by an extra 3%, which is also quite cheap. Here we have Soul Leech. Basically all of your destruction spells have a 30% chance to return health equal to 20% of the entire damage caused. Then we have Shadow and Flame, which very simply increases the bonus spell damage of your Shadow Ball and Incinerate spells. So let's talk a little bit more about the playstyle of each individual spec. So first of all 3 specs are actually viable in raiding. There's actually an extra cheeky spec for the Destruction spec that you can try out too. Now first of all, Affliction is more of a support spec for buffing the tank with improved imp and obviously Shadowy Embrace debuff that we mentioned before, but it's only really needed on really difficult hard progression fights because the other specs will absolutely trump it when it comes to the damage meters. Next we obviously have Demonology, which can actually deal really decent DPS with good pet control. The spell power buff it gives a Warlock is also really nice, and all of the extra spell resistances are very useful, particularly for when you actually need to do some cheeky ranged spell casting tanking, which does actually come into effect on a number of bosses in TBC. And it is important to mention that there's a very new theory crafting coming out literally as I speak about Demonology, which is kind of arguing that Demonology is just as good as the other specs when it comes to DPS, but obviously that remains to be seen. Obviously stay tuned for news on that front. Then we have the Destruction Shadow spec. Most people are going to go for this spec, to be honest, because of the improved Shadow Bolt talent that synergizes when you have, you know, multiple Warlocks in the group. And lastly we have the more underdog spec, the Fire Warlock, which can actually do as much damage if played correctly as a Shadow Bolt spec, However, it can actually do more damage if there is a Fire Mage in the group providing the Fire Vulnerability debuff and not a Shadow Priest in the group. It is actually still debated in the community, and I can definitely tell from my comment section whether the Fire of a Shadow Warlock is actually best in slot for DPS. But anyway, let's talk a little bit more about the playstyle of each individual 4 specs. So Affliction is obviously going to be about dot control, maintaining all of your dots on the target and then snapshotting them with procs from your spell strike set, and also some cheeky trinkets that you'll have. So basically what that means is you refresh your dots, and if you get a spell power buff and you refresh them a little bit before that buff is about to go off, to continue benefiting from that spell power buff continuously. So yeah, and then apart from that, you can also do some corruption spreading for obviously increased damage, but also the increased chance of your Nightfall to proc, which by Nightfall is a really cool proc effect, one of the very rare proc effects in the early phases of World of Warcraft that actually will provide some really cool instant Shadow Bolts. Then apart from that, you will use Shadow Bolt as your main filler ability, and you will have a little bit of pet control when it comes to the imp. Next we have Demonology. It's very similar to Affliction. You maintain all of your main dots, which is going to be Corruption and Immolate, and you're filling in with Shadow Bolt. However, you also have to do quite a lot of pet control to keep him alive. First of all, you obviously have to keep him out of AoE damage, which can be just simply, pet passive and pet attack macros. You can quickly resummon your pet when he's low in health, and honestly it is hard to keep your pet alive unless a healer is healing him, which is quite rare, let's be honest, unless you have a friend who is a healer, which is why people prefer to wait until they've got 2 pieces of the tier 5 set, which basically causes all your damage to heal your pet for 15% of the damage dealt, which obviously makes Demonology a much easier experience. Then we have Shadow Destruction spec. Just spam Shadow Bolt for 2 years and it's Bob's your uncle. In all seriousness though, there is a little bit more to it than that. For instance, you obviously have to apply your assigned curse, whether it's Curse of Elements or anything like that. And then if you're doing Curse of Doom or Curse of Agony, then you obviously want to be snapshotting that with any, trinket procs that you have available to you. It's also worthwhile sometimes using Immolate on the target for a slight boost of DPS, particularly when you have to switch from the boss to an ad. Just quickly flicking on an Immolate and let that dot roll off, and then obviously switch to whatever ad you have to go and kill. It's also useful to use Death Coil on Life Tap while moving. And then, there's stuff like Trinket Timing with your Bloodlust, and you can also use Shadow Burn to execute some targets. So it isn't just as simple as spamming Shadow Bolt the whole time, there's a little bit more to it than that, but honestly most of the time you will just be spamming Shadow Bolt. And lastly we have the Fire Warlock spec. It's a little bit more complicated than the Shadow Bolt Warlock spec, and just not as complicated as Affliction or Demonology. So first of all, you have to maintain Immolate on the target 100%, because it increases the damage of all of your other abilities, and then largely you are just going to spam Incinerate, and you will use Conflagrate on shorter fights, and you can also execute with a Conflagrate and Shadow Burn combo for insane execute damage. You will not beat a Fire Destruction Warlock when you're clearing, ads in dungeons, because they can just do such instantaneous damage to execute targets, which obviously just puts them at the top of the DPS meters quite often. And then lastly, the last thing to micromanage is timing Immolate of your spell power buffs, from your trinkets and things like that. I always found this spec to be a good middle ground. It's not as complicated as the Affliction or Demonology specs, and it's also not as boring and as simple as the Shadow Bolt spec. It's just somewhere nicely snugly in between those 2 specs. And lastly, let's evaluate their PvE and PvP performance. So overall, the Warlock is an absolute top tier DPS for the entire expansion on both single target boss fights and AoE damage. They are largely considered just the absolute kings of TBC raiding, and are also great for dungeon rep farming when grouped up with a mage. And then PvP performance, they are again just ridiculously strong, top tier class, S tier class. What's great about playing a Warlock is they're really beefy and really tanky in the SLSL spec, which is Soul Life On and Soul Link spec. They just have ridiculously strong healing, a massive amount of damage reduction on themselves, and they can also provide really decent pressure by spreading all of their dots. They have really strong utility. They fit into basically every single comp. Any other strong class. You can play them with a warrior, you can play them with a mage, you can play them with a priest, you can play them with a rogue, you can play a Warlock with anything. They're just ridiculously strong. So yeah, overall they are just going to be one of those great gladiator earning classes. But anyway guys, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe, as that really helps out. But anyway, my name is MetaGoblin. Until my next video, ciao.